The slam of my mailbox echoed like a gunshot across my front yard as I pulled out yet another envelope with the dreaded Pine Crest Village HOA logo. My stomach tightened as I tore it open right there on my driveway, revealing a notice of violation. A $55 fine, immediate payment required. I nearly choked. $55 for what? My eyes scanned down to find the offense: grass exceeding height regulations by half an inch. Half an inch. I've been working double shifts at the hospital all week, barely finding time to eat, let alone micromanage my lawn. Across the street, Sandra Wilkins watered her perfectly manicured roses, her smug smile barely concealed as she glanced my way before looking away. Of course, Sandra, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog and HOA board secretary, had probably measured my grass with a ruler while I was saving lives. Inside, I tossed the notice onto my growing pile of bills. Since my husband Dan left 6 months ago, money had been tight. My nursing salary covered the basics, but these random HOA fines were pushing me to the edge, especially with my daughter Lily's asthma medication costing a fortune even with insurance. Determined to fight this absurdity, I called the HOA office. "Pine Crest Village HOA, this is Carol," a bored voice answered. "Hi, I just got a fine for my grass being half an inch too tall," I said. "That seems excessive, especially since I wasn't notified there was a problem before getting fined." Carol sighed. "According to our updated bylaws, we no longer require warnings before issuing fines for standard violations. Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the revised agreement you signed." "Revised agreement?" I protested. "I never signed anything new." "The board approved changes last month," she replied. "Notices were emailed to all residents." Later, I found it in my spam folder, a 47-page PDF buried between ads for weight loss supplements and Nigerian princes. Who actually reads those? That evening, as I helped Lily with her homework, a knock startled us. It was Marcus, my elderly neighbor, leaning on his cane. "Evening, Rachel," he said. "Wanted to warn you, Sandra's on the warpath. She got me last week for leaving my trash can out 4 hours too long. Cost me $75. "That's outrageous," I said. "How can they keep raising these fines?" Marcus shook his head. "Been worse since that new board president Richard Walters took over. Big shot real estate developer. Rumor is he's using our fines to fund the fancy clubhouse renovation nobody asked for." "Can they even do that?" I asked. "Been wondering the same. My nephew's a paralegal. Says some of these rules might not be legal, but fighting an HOA is expensive." After Marcus left, I tucked Lily into bed and stayed up researching. He was right. Many HOAs abuse their power, but challenging them takes time and money I didn't have. Still, I refused to pay this unjust fine. I'd confront the board at their next meeting instead. But the following week brought more chaos. My air conditioning broke on the hottest day of summer, costing $400 I barely had, and Lily needed an emergency inhaler refill when her asthma flared up from the heat. By the time the HOA meeting arrived, I was exhausted, stressed, and in no mood for Sandra's attitude. The community center buzzed with tension as I walked in. About 20 neighbors sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs while Richard Walters, a slick man in an expensive suit, called the meeting to order. Sandra sat beside him, clipboard ready, shooting disapproving glances at anyone who whispered. When they opened the floor for resident concerns, I raised my hand. "The chair recognizes Rachel Thompson," Richard announced with practiced formality. I stood, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'd like to discuss the new fine structure. Many of us weren't properly informed about these changes, and some fines seem excessive, like charging $55 for grass being half an inch too tall." Sandra's lips thinned. "Property values depend on consistent standards. If we make exceptions—" "I'm not asking for an exception," I interrupted. "I'm questioning whether these rules are reasonable or even legal, and I'd like to see the financial records showing where these fines go." The room fell silent. Richard cleared his throat. "HOA financial records are available by appointment during office hours." "Great," I replied. "I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon." Little did I know this was just the beginning of their retaliation. After the HOA meeting, several neighbors approached me, whispering their own horror stories. Ellen had been fined for a bird feeder, Miguel had to repaint his door because the blue wasn't approved, and even Mrs. Jenkins, a 30-year resident, got a violation for wind chimes. Sandra cornered me as I left. "You're making a mistake, Rachel," she hissed. "The board doesn't appreciate troublemakers." "I'm not causing trouble," I replied. "I just want transparency." You should focus on maintaining your property instead of questioning authority, she snapped. I noticed your holiday lights are still on the back patio from last year. That's another violation. My jaw tightened. Thanks for the heads up, Sandra. I'll take care of that right after I review those financial records. The next day, I arrived at the HOA office during my lunch break, only to find a note. Office closed for emergency maintenance. How convenient. That evening, while helping Lily water our small vegetable garden, I caught Sandra watching from behind her curtains. My phone buzzed, an email with another violation notice, $75 for unauthorized garden structures. The stakes were rising, and I had a sinking feeling this was personal. As I tucked Lily into bed, she asked, "Mommy, why does that lady always look angry at our house?" "Some people like rules more than people, sweetheart," I said, kissing her forehead. By morning, the situation escalated beyond anything I'd imagined. Bright red letters stared back at me from my front door. Final notice, stamped across an official-looking document taped there for all to see. I ripped it down, checking if anyone noticed this public shamming. Pay all outstanding fines within 48 hours, $130 total, or face escalated consequences as permitted under HOA Bylaw Section 12.3. My hands shook. The amount had doubled, and escalated consequences sounded deliberately vague and intimidating. I called the HOA office, enduring 17 minutes on hold before Richard Walters answered. "Rachel Thompson, I expected your call," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "What's with this final notice? I've been trying to review financial records, and now I owe $130 with vague threats." "Nothing vague about it," he replied calmly. "You've accumulated multiple violations: original lawn height, failure to pay within the grace period, unauthorized garden structures, and as of yesterday, improper storage of recreational equipment." "Recreational equipment?" I asked. "Your daughter's bicycle was visible in your front yard for over 4 hours. Section 9.2 states it must be stored out of public view." My blood boiled. She's 7 and just learning to ride, and someone's watching my house to document this. "The board has appointed compliance monitors," he said. "It's perfectly legal." "I want a formal hearing with the full board," I demanded, "and I still haven't seen those financial records." "Fine, hearing granted for next Tuesday," he said. "As for records, our treasurer been out sick. Now about those fines. I'll address everything at the hearing," I said, hanging up. As I prepared dinner, my neighbor Amir knocked on my back door. We'd become friendly since his family moved in. "Rachel, I couldn't help overhearing your situation," he said quietly. "I'm an attorney, and what they're doing sounds questionable at best." Hope flickered inside me. "Really? I've been researching, but it's all legal jargon." He nodded. "HOAs have power, but there are limits. Do you have copies of these violations?" I showed him my growing file. His frown deepened as he reviewed them. "Insufficient notice, arbitrary enforcement, possibly excessive fines, and this monitoring borders on harassment. You can't afford a big legal battle, but I'll coach you for the hearing. Document everything. Dated photos of your property daily. Record interactions with board members. Save all communications." That night I slept better knowing I had an ally, but my relief was short-lived. The next morning I found Sandra in my front yard, photographing my house with a professional camera. She didn't even flinch when she saw me. "Excuse me, what are you doing on my property?" I demanded, still in my bathrobe. She smiled coldly. "Public documentation of ongoing violations. I'm within my rights as compliance monitor." "Not on my private property without permission," I shot back. "The easement extends 15 feet from the street," she countered. "I'm within that boundary." As we argued, Lily appeared at the door, confused. "Mommy, why is that lady yelling?" Before I could answer, Sandra snapped a photo of her. Something inside me snapped. "You do not photograph my child without consent." I stepped between them, blocking her camera. "Your emotional display is disturbing the peace," Sandra said, backing away. "That's another violation." I was about to respond when my phone rang. It was my cousin Jenna, a Channel 7 news reporter. "Hey, Ratch, can I still borrow your folding tables for tomorrow's community event? We're shooting a segment on summer heat safety in your area." An idea struck me. "Actually, Jenna, there's another story here you'd find interesting. Can you stop by this afternoon?" Sandra's eyes widened as she overheard, retreating to her car with a flash of concern on her face. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight back. After explaining everything to Jenna, she was hooked. "Homeowner associations overstepping isn't new, but this level of monitoring and harassment could make a compelling story," she said. "Would you be willing to go on camera?" I hesitated, worried about escalating things further. Let me think about it. The hearing's Tuesday. Keep me posted. Meanwhile, I'll research this HOA and its board members, she promised. That afternoon, 4 emails from the HOA arrived, each detailing a new violation with fines. My total now exceeded $300. This was ridiculous. I called Amir in a panic. They're piling on fines faster than I can read them. What are they trying to do? It's an intimidation tactic, he explained. They want you to give up and pay, but this excessive pattern strengthens your case. The next day, after dropping Lily at school, I returned home to find a maintenance truck outside my house. 2 men in uniforms were examining my utility connections. "Excuse me, what's going on?" I asked. One worker looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we have orders from Pinecrest Village HOA to evaluate your property for utility compliance." "What does that even mean?" He shrugged. "Just following work orders. Contact the association." I called Richard voicemail. Texted Amir, no reply. He was in court. Feeling uneasy, I left for my nursing shift, planning to deal with this later. When I got home at 7:30 p.m., I inserted my key into a dark house. The porch light didn't work. Inside, flipping the switch did nothing. The power was out. Using my phone flashlight, I checked the breaker box. Everything seemed normal. I called the power company, navigating their automated system until a representative answered. "I'm sorry, Ms. Thompson, but our records show your service was disconnected today at the HOA's request under their utility oversight agreement." "They can't do that," I exclaimed. "According to our records, paragraph 37 of your HOA covenant grants them authority to request disconnection for residents with outstanding violations. Resolve this with your HOA." My refrigerator full of food would spoil. Lily's asthma medication needed refrigeration, and it was nearly 90 degrees outside. The house would be unbearable by morning. I called Richard's cell repeatedly, voicemail. Sandra didn't answer. The HOA emergency line promised a response in 48 hours. As panic set in, my phone battery dropped to 15%. I texted Jenna. "HOA cut off my electricity over fines. Lily's medication will spoil. No warning, no one responding." Her reply was instant. "Stay calm. I'm on my way with the news van. We're broadcasting live in 30 minutes. Don't tell them we're coming." Standing in my darkening house, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about unfair rules. They were endangering my child's health. My fear turned to determination. If the HOA wanted a fight, they'd learn I wasn't backing down. I glanced out my window. Sandra peeked through her curtains at my darkened house, a satisfied look on her face. She had no idea what was coming. When Jenna's news van pulled up, neighbors watched from their driveways, curious about my powerless home. Mrs. Jenkins approached. "Rachel, is everything okay? The HOA cut my electricity over a $55 fine for grass being too tall," I said. Her eyes widened. "They can do that. Apparently it's in our contract." As we talked, more neighbors gathered, sharing their own HOA threats. By the time Jenna stepped out, 7 stood on my lawn. She hugged me, then introduced her crew. "This is Dave, my cameraman, and Tina, our sound tech. Dave, set up here. We're live in 8 minutes." Richard Walters' silver Mercedes turned onto our street, 2 board members in tow, tight-lipped Diane and nervous Fred. "Ms. Thompson," Richard called, ignoring the crowd and cameras, "we're here for our scheduled inspection." "Scheduled?" I echoed. "I never got notice of an inspection." He waved dismissively. "It was in the email newsletter, all homes with violations get follow-ups." Jenna stepped forward, microphone in hand, as Dave's camera light blinked on. "Good afternoon, I'm Jenna Rivera with Channel 7 News, live from Pinecrest Village. We're covering what appears to be an extreme case of HOA overreach. Sir, you're with the association." Richard's eyes darted to the camera. "This is private business, you can't film here." "We're on a public street invited by the homeowner," Jenna replied. "Care to explain why you've cut off electricity to a single mother's home over a disputed $55 fine?" "We followed procedures," he stammered. "Ms. Thompson has repeatedly violated standards." "Could you specify?" Jenna pressed. "Her grass exceeded height limits, her recycling bin stayed out past collection, children's drawings were on her driveway, packages left overnight," Diane interjected, reading from her clipboard. Jenna raised her eyebrows. "And for these minor issues, you justified cutting off utilities to a home where a child with asthma lives, whose medication requires refrigeration." Fred paled. "I wasn't informed about medical necessities." "Because they never asked," I said, stepping into frame. "They gave me one fine notice and a vague warning about consequences." The camera panned to the growing crowd, neighbors nodding. Sandra emerged from her house, marching toward us with her phone. "She's been breaking rules for months," she declared, stepping into the shot. "Look at these photos, her daughter with chalk, a package on her porch, her bin out at 7:30 p.m. when rules say 7:00. And you've been photographing my property and child without permission?" I asked, the camera catching her realization she was live on TV. Sandra's insistence faltered as she realized the camera was rolling. "That's what neighbors are supposed to do, keep the neighborhood nice," she stammered. "Vigilance is key to maintaining property values," Richard added, attempting to regain control. Jenna pressed, "Mr. Walters, is it standard HOA policy to encourage neighbors to surveil each other?" "No comment," he muttered, retreating toward his car as the crowd grew. Maria from the end of the street stepped forward. "They threatened to tow my car because my temporary tag was unsightly. While I waited for my permanent plate, I had to walk home with groceries in the rain." Jason's father added, "They fined me $100 for an unauthorized gathering when I hosted my son's Little League team for pizza after their championship." More neighbors chimed in with tales of harassment. Fred, the nervous board member, broke away from Richard. "I didn't know about any of this," he insisted. "The president and treasurer handle enforcement without full board review." "The treasurer?" Jenna asked. All eyes turned to Diane, who tried to slip away unnoticed. "Ms. Thompson," Jenna said, turning to me, "you mentioned suspicious HOA fee increases with no visible improvements. Do you have financial statements?" "I requested them 3 times," I replied. "They said they were being prepared. That's when the grass rule changed and Sandra started photographing my yard." Richard lunged forward. "This interview is over. You're trespassing." "We're on a public street," Jenna replied calmly as Dave kept filming. The mayor's office called the station during the broadcast, their producer relaying through Jenna's earpiece. "We've just received word that Mayor Collins has directed the city's Consumer Protection Division to investigate potential abuse of power by Pinecrest Village HOA," Jenna announced. Sandra slipped back to her house, her husband Doug waiting at the door, concern etched on his face. Within 30 minutes, trucks from 2 other news stations arrived. My phone, charging in Jenna's van, buzzed with messages from friends who'd seen the broadcast. A power company representative, Laura, approached. "Ms. Thompson, our president saw the segment and sent me to restore your power immediately. We're reviewing our policies on HOA-requested disconnections." As she headed to the electrical box, Richard made a final plea. "This is a misunderstanding. We were enforcing standards everyone agreed to." Jenna held out her microphone. "Then you won't mind showing us board meeting minutes approving these actions or certified letters warning Ms. Thompson about disconnection." His silence spoke volumes. When my lights flickered back on, neighbors broke into applause. Lily, who'd arrived with a friend's family during the chaos, hugged me. "Mommy, are you famous now?" "No, honey," I laughed, relief washing over me. "I just stood up to bullies." But the story wasn't over. The financial records Richard desperately hid would soon reveal his motives, and my neighbors' determined expressions as they exchanged contact info and planned an emergency meeting signaled change was coming. By nightfall, my phone buzzed relentlessly. The video of Richard stammering on live TV had gone viral. I watched the evening news from my lit couch. "Breaking tonight, Pinecrest Village HOA cuts off residents' electricity over a disputed $55 fine." Jenna's voiceover continued. "I was here for a different story when board members arrived for a routine inspection." What happened next shocked everyone. The footage replayed, Richard's color draining, Sandra's outburst. Then my phone rang, Mayor Garza herself. "Ms. Thompson, what happened is unacceptable. I've directed our city attorney to review the HOA's authority immediately." I thanked her, still processing. Social media flooded with strangers, HOA horror stories, reporters requested interviews, and 3 lawyers offered free consultations. A text from a blocked number read, "You'll regret this." I knew it was Richard or Sandra, but I wasn't scared. I was winning. A crowd gathered on my lawn that night, neighbors I barely knew bringing food, extension cords, and stories. Mrs. Jenkins brought lasagna. "They fined me $200 last year because my Christmas lights were the wrong shade of white. I was too embarrassed to fight." Jason and Maria arrived with a casserole and a petition. "We need 75% of homeowners to sign for a special election to replace the board," Jason said. "We're already at 50%, Maria added. "Nobody likes bullies, especially when they're exposed on TV." Sandra's house stayed dark, curtains drawn, her husband's car gone. Lily returned from her friends, eyes wide at the gathering. "Are we having a party?" "Sort of," I smiled. "We're fixing our neighborhood." Someone brought a projector, and Maria's husband, an accountant, displayed HOA financial records he'd requested months ago. Administrative expenses increased 340% after Richard took over, he pointed. No breakdown of where it went. Notice the timing, fines spiked with large withdrawals from the HOA account. A collective gasp filled the room. "I've tracked this for months," he admitted, but was afraid to come forward alone. Lily tugged my sleeve. "Mommy, why's everyone mad? Sometimes grown-ups forget rules should help, not hurt people," I said, kneeling beside her. The HOA had overplayed their hand, and now the neighborhood was fighting back together. A knock at the door revealed more neighbors, the Patels from the corner house and elderly Mrs. Johnson from across the community pool. "We saw the news," Mr. Patel said. "The same thing happened to us last summer. They cut our water for 3 days over a disputed fine for the wrong color mulch." Mrs. Johnson nodded. "They threatened a lien on our house because our grandson's basketball hoop was visible from the street." By midnight, we'd collected testimonies from 37 households documenting similar abuses. Maria's husband created a shared document for everyone to add their experiences. The patterns were undeniable. As people left, promising to return with more petition signatures, I checked my email. The HOA's lawyer had sent a message starting with defamation threats but ending with an offer to discuss resolution options. They were scared. Exhausted but hopeful, I crawled into bed. Then my phone lit up with a text from Jenna. "Check your email. You need to see this." In my inbox was a 5-year-old article about Richard Walters' previous neighborhood, where he'd been HOA president until resigning amid financial misconduct accusations. History was repeating itself, but this time he'd picked the wrong target. Sleep came easily, the hum of my refrigerator a reassuring sound I'd never appreciated so much. I dreamed of community gardens, neighbors waving hello, reasonable rules, and respectful conversations. Dreams of winning. When I woke, an envelope slid under my door contained banking records showing Richard had opened a private account in the Cayman Islands. Someone in Pine Crest Village had been quietly gathering evidence, waiting for a spark. That morning, 300 people packed the community center, standing room only, fanning themselves in the stuffy space. Every seat on the makeshift stage was empty except one, where the HOA's lawyer nervously shuffled papers. "Where's Mr. Walters?" someone shouted. The lawyer tapped the microphone. "Mr. Walters has taken a leave of absence for personal reasons." Boos erupted. I sat in the front row between Jenna and Lily, clutching a folder of documents, bank statements, violation notices, and a copy of state law limiting HOA powers. "Order, please," called Judge Reynolds, a retired judge from Pine Court moderating the emergency meeting. "First item, vote on temporary board members." What followed moved like a fast-forwarded movie. The community elected 5 interim members, Maria, Jason, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Patel, and Judge Reynolds, each pledging transparency and fairness. When my turn came, I approached the microphone, legs shaky but voice steady. 6 days ago, I stood in my dark kitchen wondering how I'd keep Lily's medication cold. Today, I stand with all of you, knowing we've turned on a different kind of power, neighbors standing together. I shared our findings. Escalating fines targeting specific households, the hidden utility disconnection clause, and the Cayman Islands account opened 3 months after Richard's presidency began. The lawyer interrupted. "These allegations are unfounded and potentially," Jenna stood, pressing play on her recorder. "I have the former HOA treasurer on record confirming unauthorized transfers." A hush fell as we heard a man confess he'd been sidelined for questioning Richard's accounting. By the meeting's end, 3 resolutions passed unanimously. All fines under the previous administration would be reviewed and likely refunded, the utility disconnection clause would be removed from the bylaws, and an independent financial audit would begin. As people filed out, many stopped to thank me, share stories, or introduce themselves, neighbors who'd lived near each other for years but never connected. Lily tugged my hand. "Can we go home now? I'm hungry." Home finally felt right again. Walking back, we passed Sandra's house. A "for sale" sign stood in her yard, her curtains parting slightly as she watched us. I felt no anger, just sadness that someone could live so close yet be so disconnected, her only interaction reporting violations. At our door, I found a potted plant with a note. "For your garden, better days ahead. The Johnsons." The next morning, Maria arrived early with a thick envelope. "You won't believe this," she said, spreading papers across my table. Documents showed $300,000 of HOA funds funneled into landscaping services by Evergreen Solutions, a shell company registered to Richard's brother-in-law. "The county prosecutor wants to meet today," Maria said. "This isn't just overreach, it's fraud." As we discussed next steps, Lily called from the yard, "Mommy, come quick." I rushed out, fearing trouble, but found 20 neighbors with gardening tools, plants, and soil, working together on each other's yards. "We thought we'd help everyone meet the landscaping rules," Jason explained, digging a hole for a bush. "But the fun way, together." Mrs. Jenkins taught kids to plant sunflower seeds, the Patels passed out lemonade, and even reclusive Mr. Finian pruned roses. The neighborhood was healing, one garden at a time. That afternoon, I received an email from the county prosecutor confirming Richard Walters had been taken in for questioning. Attached was a request for my testimony in the upcoming case. The weight of it hit me, not just a fight for my power, but an unraveling of years of deceit. 6 weeks later, I stood on a small stage at the newly renovated community center, cutting a ribbon to open Pine Crest Village's first community garden. The land, once reserved for an unnecessary HOA office expansion, now bloomed with possibility. Judge Reynolds, now the official HOA president, handed me the scissors. "Some leaders rule with fear and control," he said to the crowd. "Others lead by example and inspiration. Thank you for showing us the difference." Children ran through the garden pathways as neighbors shared growing tips. I noticed a familiar face at the crowd's edge, Sandra's husband, Doug, looking uncomfortable but determined. He approached slowly. "I wanted to apologize before we move. Sandra isn't well, hasn't been for a long time. It doesn't excuse what happened, but she's getting help now." I nodded, appreciating his courage. "I hope things get better for both of you." That evening, fireflies danced across freshly tended lawns as neighbors gathered for an impromptu block party. Guitars strummed, children played tag between houses, doors stayed open, and food was shared freely. Jenna found me on my porch swing, watching it unfold. "Your story aired nationally yesterday," she said. "I've gotten calls from communities across the country asking how you fought back." "Tell them it wasn't just me," I replied. "It was all of us remembering what neighborhoods are supposed to be." As Lily ran past with new friends, laughing and carefree, I realized something profound had shifted. The HOA still existed, but its purpose had transformed, from controlling to connecting, from punishing to protecting. When my electricity was cut, I'd felt powerless. Now, surrounded by genuine community, I understood true power had nothing to do with rules on paper and everything to do with people standing together in the light. The aftermath unfolded swiftly. The financial audit confirmed our suspicions. Over $300,000 had been siphoned through Evergreen Solutions, with transactions traced back to Richard's brother-in-law. The prosecutor's case grew stronger with each neighbor's testimony, painting a picture of systematic fraud masked as petty enforcement. Richard faced charges of embezzlement and misuse of authority, while Diane, the treasurer, cut a deal to testify against him, revealing how they'd manipulated bylaws to silence dissent. Sandra's role as compliance monitor came under scrutiny too, her obsessive documentation deemed harassment by the court, though Doug's plea about her mental health softened her penalty to community service and mandated counseling. The "for sale" sign stayed up. They moved within a month, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed. For me, life settled into a new rhythm. My nursing shifts felt lighter knowing I wasn't alone anymore. Lily's asthma flare-ups lessened with the stress gone, and our little garden thrived with help from the Johnsons and Patels. The petition Jason and Maria started succeeded. 75% of homeowners voted in the new board, officially cementing Judge Reynolds and the others as leaders. They slashed frivolous rules, lowered dues, and prioritized community projects like the garden. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now waved hello, stopped to chat, or dropped off extra zucchini from their plots. The community center, once a place of tension, hosted potlucks and kids' craft nights. Mrs. Jenkins even organized a white lights-only Christmas decorating contest as a playful jab at the old regime, and we all laughed as we strung up deliberately mismatched strands. But the ripple effects went beyond Pine Crest Village. Jenna's national broadcast sparked a movement. HOA reform petitions popped up in dozens of states, and a few lawmakers proposed bills to cap fines and ban utility disconnection clauses. I got emails from strangers thanking me for inspiring them to challenge their own boards, some even winning small victories like refunded fines or ousted tyrants. Locally, the power company revised its policies, requiring court orders for HOA-requested shutoffs, citing my case as the catalyst. It wasn't fame I'd sought, as Lily had jokingly asked, but a quiet pride in knowing one's stand against a $55 fine had ignited something bigger. The Cayman Islands account led to a federal investigation. Rumors swirled that Richard's real estate empire might crumble under the scrutiny, a fitting end for a man who'd built his power on petty tyranny. One evening, as I watered our garden, Lily ran up with a sunflower she'd grown with Mrs. Jenkins. "Look, Mommy, it's taller than me." I smiled, measuring it against her, well over the half-inch limit that started this mess. "It's perfect," I said, hugging her. Across the street, Maria waved, her own garden blooming where Sandra's roses once stood. The neighborhood wasn't just healed, it was reborn. And as the sun set, casting a warm glow over houses no longer divided by fear, I knew we'd turned darkness into light, not just in my home, but in every corner of Pine Crest Village. The transformation of Pine Crest Village didn't stop with the garden or the new board. It seeped into every interaction, every shared smile. One crisp fall morning, I found Mr. Finian, the reclusive widower who'd barely left his house before, chatting with Jason over a rose bush. "Never thought I'd care about pruning again," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "Turns out I just needed a reason to step outside." Jason grinned, handing him a pair of shears. "We've got plenty of reasons now." That same week, the Patels invited Lily and me for dinner. Homemade samosas and stories about their old neighborhood, where an HOA had once fined them for a flagpole. "We thought it was normal," Mrs. Patel said, shaking her head. "You showed us it doesn't have to be." Lily beamed, her mouth full, and I felt a quiet gratitude for these new ties, forged not by proximity but by shared struggle and triumph. The legal fallout kept unfolding, too. Richard Walters' arraignment made local headlines. Embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power topped the list of charges. Diane's testimony painted him as the mastermind, though she wasn't blameless. Her deal landed her probation and a hefty fine. The Evergreen Solutions shell company unraveled, revealing a web of fake invoices and offshore accounts that stunned even the prosecutor. "This isn't just an HOA case anymore," he told me during a deposition. "It's a blueprint for how power can corrupt any small system." My testimony, hours of recounting fines, utility shutoffs, and Sandra's surveillance, felt like reliving the nightmare, but each word strengthened the case. The feds got involved when the Cayman Islands account linked to a broader real estate scam Richard had run in 3 states. His empire, once a source of his smug authority, was crumbling, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction knowing my $55 fight had cracked it open. Back home, the community center became our heartbeat. Judge Reynolds, with his steady hand and dry humor, turned meetings into something almost enjoyable, short, fair, and focused on what mattered. When winter rolled in, we held a holiday fair there, tables laden with cookies, crafts, and Mrs. Jenkins' infamous wrong shade of white, lights twinkling defiantly. Lily sold her sunflower seeds in little packets, proudly telling everyone, "These grew taller than the rules." The crowd laughed, and I caught Judge Reynolds chuckling too. "Kid, got a point," he said, slipping her $1 for a packet. That night, as snow dusted the ground, neighbors caroled door to door, their voices weaving through streets once silenced by fear. Sandra's old house stood empty, the for sale sign weathered but still up. Doug had emailed me once, saying they'd settled in a condo downtown and she was improving with therapy. I hoped it was true, though her shadow no longer loomed over us. Jenna's national story kept rippling outward. I got a call from a woman in Ohio whose HOA had backed off a $200 fine after she waived my case at them, and a man in Texas sent a photo of his new board election victory, captioned, "Thanks to Pine Crest." A senator even cited us in a speech pushing for HOA oversight laws, calling it the little neighborhood that roared. Locally, the power company's policy shift became permanent. No more HOA shutoffs without judicial review, and they sent me a formal apology letter, which Lily framed as a joke. "Mommy's trophy," she giggled, hanging it in the kitchen. The absurdity of it all, a $55 fine spiraling into this, still hit me sometimes, but the pride outweighed the exhaustion. We hadn't just won, we'd rewritten what home could mean. One quiet Sunday, Maria dropped by with coffee and news. The audit's final report came in, she said, sliding it across my table. The $300,000 was just the tip. Over 5 years, Richard's crew had skimmed nearly $500,000, funneled through fake contracts and inflated dues. Refunds start next month, she added. Yours covers all your fines plus interest. I stared at the numbers, then laughed. Guess I can fix the air conditioning now, she grinned. Or plant more sunflowers. Outside, Lily and her friends raced bikes, visible for hours, no fines in sight, while Mr. Finian waved from his porch, shears in hand. The neighborhood hummed with life, each sound a testament to what we'd built. Later, as I watered our garden, a news van pulled up, not Jenna, but a national outlet. Ms. Thompson, we're doing a follow-up on HOA reform, the reporter said. Your story, still inspiring people. I smiled, glancing at Lily's sunflower towering overhead. It's not my story anymore, it's ours. The national news crew stayed an hour, filming the garden, the kids on bikes, and neighbors chatting over fences, scenes of a Pine Crest village reborn. This started with a $55 fine? The reporter asked, incredulous. It started with someone thinking they could bully us into silence, I corrected, nodding toward Lily, who waved from her bike. We just proved them wrong. The segment aired a week later, titled The Power of One, how a single mom sparked a movement. It wasn't quite right, I wasn't alone, but the message resonated. My inbox filled with more stories. A retiree in Florida who'd won back her porch swing, a young couple in Oregon who'd ousted their HOA president. Pine Crest became a symbol, a spark that lit fires nationwide. Locally, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known since Dan left. The refunded fines, $130 plus interest, fixed my air conditioning, and I splurged on a new bike for Lily, bright red and rule-breakingly parked in the yard. She rode it daily, her laughter echoing down streets now alive with kids playing, dogs barking, and neighbors calling hellos. Richard Walters' trial wrapped up that spring, guilty on all counts, embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 7 years, calling it a lesson in accountability. Diane got 2 years probation and a $50,000 fine, her cooperation sparing her worse. The feds seized the Cayman accounts, and rumors swirled that Richard's real estate firm faced bankruptcy as clients fled. I watched the verdict on TV with Maria and Judge Reynolds, a quiet victory toast with coffee instead of champagne. He thought he'd bury us in fines, Maria said, shaking her head. Buried himself instead. The HOA's new board used the recovered funds wisely, repaving the community pool lot, adding benches to the garden, lowering dues again. Judge Reynolds pushed transparency, posting every penny online. No more shadows, he'd say, and we believed him. Sandra's old house sold to a young family who joined our block parties, their toddler wobbling after Lily with a grin. Doug sent a final note. She's stable now. Thank you for not pressing charges. I hadn't. It felt like enough to let her fade away. The garden grew wilder each season, sunflowers towering over tomatoes and marigolds, a living defiance of the half-inch rule that started it all. One summer evening, Mrs. Jenkins hosted a rule-breaking potluck. Everyone brought dishes banned under old bylaws, spicy chili, neon cupcakes, anything unapproved. We ate under mismatched Christmas lights, laughing at the memory of Sandra's clipboard and Richard's smug suits. Jenna swung by, her career boosted by the story. Got a promotion, she grinned. They're calling me the HOA Slayer now. She handed me a clipping from a legal journal citing Pine Crest in a push for national HOA reform, limits on fines, bans on utility clauses, mandatory transparency. You did this, she said. I shook my head. We did. Lily ran up, dirt-streaked and happy, holding a marigold. For you, Mommy. I tucked it behind her ear, feeling the weight of her trust, our home, this community we'd reclaimed. Months later, I stood in the community center at the 1-year anniversary of the power cutoff. Judge Reynolds unveiled a plaque, Pine Crest Village Community Garden built by unity, rooted in resilience. Neighbors cheered, Lily loudest of all. Afterward, we spilled outside, fireflies flickering as guitars strummed and kids chased each other. Mr. Finian, now a regular, handed me a rose cutting. For your garden, he said. Keeps growing, doesn't it? I nodded, looking around, Maria grilling, the Patels pouring lemonade, Jason kicking a ball with Lily. This was power, not in cutting off electricity or enforcing petty rules, but in lifting each other up. The HOA still existed, a quiet framework for pool hours and trash days, but its heart had shifted. We, turned darkness into light, fear into trust, silence into song. As Lily raced past, her red bike glinting in the dusk, I knew we'd won more than a fight, we'd won a home. And across the country, others were winning too, one neighborhood at a time, all because we dared to stand together against a measly $55 fine.